Queen.
Under the public's gaze, King Charles follows his mother's hearse on foot up the Royal Mile here in Edinburgh. But as the country mourns her death, can he forge a new bond with its people?
Also tonight, as Russia is forced out of a swathe of Ukraine and pro-Kremlin voices sound the alarm at Russia's military mistakes, we ask key White House advisor Fiona Hill and the Russian diplomat who quit over the war to assess where this leaves President Putin.
Under the lukewarm sun this afternoon here in Edinburgh, King Charles III walked behind the hearse carrying the coffin of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. The King and his siblings moved slowly and solemnly, and as they passed, the people largely fell silent. The crowds were 2, 3, 4 deep alongside the narrow Royal Mile. Some hung out of office windows. There were school children with flowers, and many were filming this moment of history on their phones. A vigil is now underway at St Giles Cathedral here in Edinburgh as the Queen's coffin lies at rest, draped in the red and yellow royal standard. And for 24 hours, the public will be able to pay their respects. I asked people why they'd come today. It's history, said one 14-year-old. To say goodbye to a fantastic monarch, said one woman. To bond with the new king, said another. To get out of school, said a 17-year-old. Earlier in the day, King Charles made his first address as monarch to MPs and peers in Parliament and promised selfless duty. Because the Queen died in Scotland, the focus for 4 days now has been on this country. And the conclusion of her 70-year reign inevitably means questions about the transition from Queen to King and what it might mean for the future of Scotland in the United Kingdom. We'll talk more about that during the programme, but first let's give you a sense of the new King's address to the Scottish Parliament as the Queen completed her journey into Edinburgh.
I know that the people of Scotland share with me a profound sense of grief at the death of my beloved mother. Through all the years of her reign, the Queen, like so many generations of our family before her, found in the hills of this land and in the hearts of its people a haven and a home. My mother felt, as I do, the greatest admiration for the Scottish people, for their magnificent achievements and their indomitable spirit. And it was the greatest comfort for her to know, in turn, the true affection in which she was held. The knowledge of that deep and abiding bond must be to us a solace as we mourn the end of a life of incomparable service. If I might paraphrase the words of the great Robert Burns, my dear mother was the friend of man, the friend of truth, the friend of age, and guide of youth. Few hearts like hers with virtue warmed, few heads with knowledge so informed.
Well, let's talk more about the day with some people who know King Charles, a Deputy Lord Lieutenant of Aberdeenshire and a singer, sing regularly at Crathy Kirk actually. Fiona Kennedy, welcome to you, and Susan Brown, who is chaplain to His Majesty the King in Scotland, which was a new title confirmed by email yesterday, you told me earlier. Yeah. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
How would you describe the Thanksgiving service at St Giles?
The Thanksgiving service today I thought was absolutely glorious. It was beautifully done. The singing was otherworldly. The choir was stunning. Really, it was literally choirs of angels. It sounded magnificent. Karen Matheson singing a Gaelic psalm, another highlight. I think the feeling was one of huge love, respect, reverence and sadness, obviously, and desperate sadness, really, because, well, King Charles has lost his mother. The whole family, they've lost a grandmother, a mother, and I think you could really sense the feeling of support for them all on behalf of Scotland. It was a beautiful service.
Susan, what would you say?
Yeah, it's an important opportunity for the people of Scotland to mourn their Queen. And it was done wonderfully well, including a very short address from the moderator, but also making use of the Cardinal, the head of the Roman Catholic Church in Scotland, Leo Cushley, as well as the Primus, Mark Strange. So it was great to have the different denominations coming together, and also sitting in the congregation there were people of different faiths, and I think that might reflect how future monarchy might choose chaplains, perhaps in the not too distant future.
Okay, well, we'll see.
We'll see.
You were in the cathedral for part of the vigil, and for me it's extraordinary to see King Charles and his siblings and others with their backs to their mother's coffin, protecting it, shielding it in a way, a very, very ancient tradition in modern Britain in the 21st century. Is that vigil important?
Yeah, I mean, for me as a chaplain, there are 10 of us, and some of my colleagues did exactly that with Her Majesty all day yesterday, from when she arrived in Edinburgh at Holyrood Palace through until she came to St Giles. But seeing the royal family, the children of Her Majesty standing around the coffin tonight actually took my breath away. It was really quite a kind of startling moment.
Why?
The important thing about it, well, yeah, exactly why. The important thing about it is that this is them grieving. So much of these next few days are all about duty and about what needs to be done. This was a moment of duty, yes, but also they do what so many of us avoid doing. They are confronting what is the reality: their mother has died. And I think too often we push aside death and the consequences of death. We almost clinicalise it. Ship people off to hospital, let them die there, and then as soon as we can, get them to undertakers and everything else. This is a moment for people to adjust to the fact that grief is something that has to be faced.
You have to confront it.
If you want to be able to live with it healthfully and helpfully in the future.
There was no bigger moment for me than when the crown was placed on the coffin, and I think that's the time for me where it really hit home. It was that is the crown with which the Queen was crowned, and presumably King Charles will be crowned, and that sense of history, but the sense of her achievements, but the simplicity of the flowers, and I suppose her humbleness, and yet juxtaposition the crown and the simple flowers. I thought that was very telling and very moving.
What do you think about the numbers of people who are now, as we are talking this evening, filing past to pay their respects to the Queen? Slowly and solemnly, they want to be there, and they will do this through the night, up to tomorrow afternoon, and then people in London will be doing that on Wednesday, we're told.
It's a great mark of the love and affection and the respect that they have for Her Majesty, and just I think the feeling of loss, but also the outpouring of love. And I'm sure you're absolutely right. We don't confront death easily, and we don't like, and certainly in Scotland, if I may say, I mean, we're kind of we try to be tough and
get on with things.
And get on with things.
Yeah.
And I think it's asking so much of the royal family, or any family, to grieve with the public watching. I think that's got to be incredibly hard for them.
Susan, what will King Charles need to do you think, to achieve the kind of respect that his mum achieved in this country?
I think he has already shown in the way he walked up behind the coffin, up the Royal Mile. You talked about that earlier, and how moving it was to see him just walking so slowly, so purposefully, This is his mum, after all. It's not just the Queen. His strong sense of duty, every bit as strong, it would seem, as his mother's. That is going to be incredibly important. But he also brings to the monarchy his own interests, which will be things like ecology, interfaith, I mean, lots of different things, which he will try and find a way of leaving his mark on our nation in a way that is lasting.
Right. What do you think he will have to do, Fiona?
I've only met him a few times. He has enormous charm. I met him at Peterhead Fish Market, and he opened the new fish market there. The community turned out. He was wonderful with everyone. He understands. He is very well briefed. I think he loves fish, but he enjoys people, and it would seem to me he loves to laugh. He's very good at telling people that they're marvellous and what they're doing is marvellous, and that makes people feel great. And I think the Queen also, in a different way, of course, had that ability. I mean, you just felt that her smile lit up rooms and spoke volumes. So he will make it his own. He's had a very long time of preparation, and I'm sure he will be brilliant.
I suppose there's also his passion for the promotion of young people through his work in the Prince's Trust, and that's incredibly important in today's society, just to get the young people good start in life, get them trained and show them that you have faith and trust in them.
I saw a lot of teenagers today. I talked to a lot of teenagers today. Thank you, both of you. Appreciate you coming to sit on tall stools in a wind on Monday night. I really do. Thank you. Susan Brown and Fiona Kennedy. Thank you very much. Now, the late Queen was definitely at home here in Scotland. That's been made clear by Fiona and Susan. And the large crowds here today seemed to recognise that. But with fresh calls for Scottish independence, can the new King help keep the Union together and forge his own relationship with the people? Here's Newsnight's political editor, Nick Watt.
A bereaved son mourning his mother, marching in step with his siblings. Then a mild disturbance as a protester shouted at the Duke of York.
Andrew, you're a settled man!
Support for the King as he followed his mother's coffin on its way to lying in rest overnight on Edinburgh's Royal Mile. And then a king on official duties to establish his own relations with Scottish political leaders ahead of a week travelling across his troubled kingdom.
My mother felt, as I do, the greatest admiration for the Scottish people, for their magnificent achievements and their indomitable spirit.
The regal and political heart of Edinburgh, a very old palace side by side with a relatively new parliament. A consensus on the monarchy, with Parliament almost exclusively supportive, but a fracture on Scotland's future in the UK, with a narrow parliamentary majority wanting out. And so a delicate task for the new King as he introduces himself as monarch in Scotland. This is a cherished home for his family and a vital part of their identity as symbols of the whole Union.
Victoria started the tradition which the late Queen has continued to carry out. That is strong Scottish connections and therefore not the odd visit, but embracing the culture and history and landscape of the nation in a very significant way.
Today is one of those happy occasions as the Queen and the Duke play with
a young boy and future king in Scotland. Queen Victoria's Highland Paradise, a scene of happiness, but also of sadness, where our Queen lived out her final days. Balmoral, in good times and bad times, a late summer retreat. But Scotland is also a royal place of work and a place of political learning.
I cannot forget that I was crowned Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Royal scepticism about devolution nearly half a century ago. Adapting when devolution became the settled will of the Scottish people 2 decades later.
I have spoken before of my deep and abiding affection for this wonderful country, and of the many happy memories Prince Philip and I always held of our time here.
A place in her heart, but a raised eyebrow 7 years earlier at the prospect of independence.
She said, "It's been a considerable pleasure to me to provide this honour."
Scotland's most prominent historian notes that the new king has traditionally been less popular than his mother north of the border. But the sensitive approach of the late Queen should stand him in good stead.
One of the reasons why Charles has got a few cards up his sleeve in this respect is that his mother has never in any sense lost her acceptance and our public set of statements about Scotland being a nation and an historic nation, and remembering, of course, that the Union of 1707, in legal terms, let's leave aside the political aspects, the Union of 1707 was a legal partnership, a legal agreement between two historic nations.
Out in force to pay their respects, sadness and wondering about the future.
There's the kind of excitement of seeing the king. I mean, he was really close to us right here. I've got a great picture of him. But also seeing the hearse just before that, it was really sad.
I think a lot of people like King Charles. I think a lot of people have supported him from obviously the Queen passing and stuff, and I think he'll be a good ruler as well. Yeah, I definitely think that he'll prove himself.
I would hope he would be a healer for the future and he can heal Scotland, because I think Scotland's been torn apart, I think. So I hope he does heal it, yeah.
The crown of Scotland, dating back nearly 500 years, laid on the coffin of the United Kingdom's longest reigning monarch, a symbol of how Scotland has its own history.
Let's talk now to Lord Robertson, the former Labour Defence Secretary and NATO Secretary-General, and Michael Keating, who is Emeritus Professor of Politics at Aberdeen University. Welcome, both of you. First of all, Lord Robertson, how was today for you?
Emotional, moving. It was a ceremony that I thought was entirely appropriate, really quite wonderful, but incredibly moving in as much as it seemed that we were marking something dramatic and historic, and at the same time very personal. But the high point for me, or the point that got me most, was watching the young soldiers carrying in the coffin. Young guys with a very heavy coffin. Huge responsibility, enormous honour, but an enormous responsibility too, carrying in their sovereign lady. And, you know, I felt, I was at lunch with her with the Knights of the Thistle on the 30th of June, the last day of June.
At lunch with the Queen?
Yeah. And she was in great form that day, smiling, talking to all of the Knights. And here she was now lying and watching the royal family, who were deeply affected. You know, it was a state occasion, and they're trained not to show emotion, but they were. So, you know, the fact is that it was a family occasion, but we're part of the family. The British people are part of that family, and we too are grieving at the death of the Queen.
Michael Keating, the fact that the Queen died in Scotland has meant that the focus has been on this country intensely for 4 days. What effect does that have on the future of Scotland in the United Kingdom, if any?
The monarchy has been a very important institution in the United Kingdom as a symbol both of unity, because it's one institution that works right across the United Kingdom, but also of diversity, because the monarchs have been very careful to recognise the different characteristics of the different nations. And there's a particular close attachment to Scotland. They have their own titles here, they have their own banner here. They attend the Church of Scotland, and it's significant that the King had to take an oath to maintain the independence of the Church of Scotland. And in the last 20 years, there's been a political dimension, because we have a parliament in Scotland, in Wales, Wales, the new institutions in Northern Ireland. So it was very important that the King should go to the Scottish Parliament and meet the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales. There isn't a First Minister in Northern Ireland at the moment. This is all important. Whether that's enough to keep the Union together is another question, because it's under a tremendous strain at the moment for other reasons altogether.
Right. What do you think about the focus being on Scotland in the way it has been in the last few days?
Well, that was inevitable because she died in Scotland.
Although you say that, you know, not everybody knew. I mean, I met a woman today and she said she felt gratified that, as she put it, the Queen was still here. She said, I thought they'd fly her down to London straight away.
Yeah, no, it was always designed that she would, you know, there would be this period in Scotland, and I think that was important, and I think she wanted that to be the case. She had a huge affection for Scotland, and she showed it in so many different ways. And it wasn't just her. As the institution of the royalty, she personally was involved in it. She loved being at Balmoral. She loved Scotland and the Scottish moors and being there free and informal at that time. So I think the fact that this ceremony is taking place is not simply to do with the accident of her dying here. She was rooted in Scotland as well.
Michael Keating, what challenges will King Charles face that perhaps the Queen didn't?
There's a growing constitutional crisis in this country. Support for independence is running about 50%. Neither side, neither the Unionists nor the Nationalists, is winning the argument at the moment. But that question is really not going to go away. As far as the monarchy is concerned, there's support for the monarchy in Scotland, but less than there is in England. There was tremendous support for the Queen as an individual, less support for the institution of monarchy. And there is a tendency for people who support independence to be pro-republic and people who are unionists to be pro the monarchy, although that itself is not going to change anybody's mind. I think you're up for independence and then you tend to go for a republic. But this is going to make it much more difficult than it perhaps was in the past to try and be the monarch of all four nations and to maintain a position of neutrality on the Constitution, which is the position that the monarch has to take.
Yeah, I mean...
But that may be the case, but at the same time, you know, the King, as Prince Charles, was always in the shadow of his mother. His mother dominated the scene, inevitably, as she would, and therefore he could not impose a personality. But we know, those of us who have met him and know his views, is that he is as Scottish and in connection there. Indeed, sometimes the Welsh say, why is the Prince of Wales so much involved in Scottish affairs? So, you know, once he's out of that shadow, inevitably, I think we'll see a personality that is determined to make sure that the Union stays together, that the various components
But he'll have to remain neutral, obviously. You know, we had the Queen before the 2014 independence referendum outside the church saying she hoped people would think very carefully about the future. Some thought that was neutral, some didn't. He will have to stay neutral.
Well, he will stay neutral, I'm sure he will, but I think he is going to be the king of the United Kingdom, and that will matter to him as well. So therefore, making sure that he's rooted in the various parts of the kingdom will be part of his priority. He can be dispassionate, he can be neutral, but he can still show a sensitivity to the feelings that are around, and he will.
If there is a further independence referendum, the SNP policy is to keep the monarch as head of state, but not everyone in the SNP wants that. That might cause problems.
It may do. The SNP policy is to keep the king as King of Scotland, as he's King of Canada and Australia and other places. Constitutionally, that's not a problem. But it does seem that the pro-independence voters are more in favour of a republic. Now, if there were an independence referendum, if it were to succeed, then it might be a gesture towards the Unionists to say, we'll keep the monarchy because at least you'll keep one union, the monarchical union, even though you are losing the political union.
Although I suppose you could, sorry to interrupt, you could argue if you promise to keep the monarch as head of state in an independent Scotland, that might broaden the appeal of independence to a wider constituency of people.
I don't think it would influence anybody's vote. I think it works the other way around. I think if you're pro-independence, you tend to be pro-republic. But it may be a gesture to unionists, a gesture of conciliation to say, look, you're not going to lose everything because we've still got the monarchy just as the Commonwealth has the monarchy, or at least those countries of the Commonwealth that still have the Queen and the King now have something in common.
Why is this visit to the four nations for King Charles, beginning here in Scotland, important?
Well, it's important because he needs to be seen. He needs to impose his new personality on the various parts of the kingdom. You know, he is a man of real substance, of thought, of campaigning zeal, and all of that has now got to be subordinated to the model that his mother had. But I think we've got to suspend judgment now to see what he's going to do and how he's going to do it. And I think we will be surprised at the quality that he now represents, not simply through the experience and the practice he's had waiting on his mother, but also the flowering of a personality now that the towering figure of his mother is now put into the background and he is the king.
Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you for coming along to talk to us on Newsnight, Lord Robertson and Michael Keating. Many thanks. Right, let's go back to London now, and Mark is here. He's got the latest on the dramatic Ukrainian counter-offensive. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Victoria. Well, while the UK's national mourning has dominated global headlines for days, there have been dramatic developments in Ukraine. Indeed, some have gone as far as to claim that defeats suffered by Russia in recent days mark the end of months of stalemate. In a moment, the political dimension. But first, let's review what's happened on the battlefield. These are indeed heady times for the Ukrainian military, making great gains in the past week, retaking these parts in purple there of Kharkiv and Luhansk districts, an area equivalent to twice the size of Greater London. There's no dispute from Russia that they've fallen back to a new front line, which they say now runs along the Oskil River, though they're claiming it was a planned withdrawal. How did the Ukrainians do it? Through the wearing down of Russian forces tank by tank, soldier by soldier over recent months, to the point where they were stretched taut across 1,000 kilometres of front lines. When Ukrainian forces began their offensive around Kherson last month, Russian reinforcements were sent there, leaving the Donbass denuded of troops. The Ukrainians had managed to concentrate around 10,000 soldiers of their own for a move towards Kupiansk and to break through in the classic style, using armour with mine-clearing devices and significant number of tanks to follow up. Once the Russians started panicking and fleeing, other thrusts were launched, for example towards the town of Izium. The result, the territorial conquest I mentioned at the start, leading Ukrainian troops to celebrate the liberation of dozens of communities, but also terrific losses to the Russians of equipment, of people, with hundreds of prisoners certainly being taken and many more Russians fleeing or deserting, and of ammunition, big stocks of which have been left behind to fuel Ukrainian guns rather than Russian ones. And that speaks to Russia's dilemmas of what to do next, how to regain the initiative when they're having such difficulties making good losses of people and weapons. Even reporters on Russian TV have abandoned attempts to put a positive gloss on the setbacks.
У меня около 20 пунктов недостатков, но я не буду их сейчас оглашать. Вот. Непросто. На фронте непросто.
Well, the Kremlin's response, first up, strikes on Ukrainian power stations, with plants in Kharkiv, Pavlohrad and Kremenchug being hit by missile strikes overnight. The big nuclear power station at Zaporizhia has also been taken offline. That's partly for safety reasons, but also as part of a Russian drive to cut the power off to Ukrainian civilians. They're trying to restore supplies, that's the Ukrainians, but the Russian aim is evidently to starve them of energy as the seasons turn colder. But as for the fight at the front, Russia appears now to be running out of options. Well, joining us now to discuss this and how it could play out for Russia are Boris Bondarev, who was a senior diplomat at Russia's mission in Geneva until he quit earlier this year in protest at the war, and from Washington, D.C. by Fiona Hill, who was Donald Trump's most trusted senior advisor on Russia and is now at the Brookings Institution. Fiona Hill, if we could start with you. The Ukrainians do now seem to have the military initiative. What are the options for Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think we're seeing the range of options that he has at his disposal already being used. As you've just mentioned, the attacks on power stations, trying to cut off power to the civilian population in the hope that this will lead to the broader intimidation of Ukraine. I think we can expect a lot more of attacks like this on civilian centres as well as other civilian infrastructure. And of course, there's all kinds of other ways of putting pressure on what they see as the reasons for Ukraine's success, which is in part not just the bravery of the Ukrainian troops, but also the supplies that they've been getting from the United States and from other European countries in terms of ammunition and equipment. And so we might see more attacks on ammunition transfers, on stores of ammunitions and depots, just as the Ukrainians have been doing this against the Russians. And also, I do think that they'll try to exploit all of the rifts in Europe and in the United States and between the United States and Europe to try to soften up the support for Ukraine. So I think we should expect all kinds of efforts on many different fronts from the Russians at this stage.
Boris Bondarev, in terms of how this is processed in Russia, you took this courageous stance and you resigned, but there haven't been many other officials, have there, who followed your example. Do you think this will change anyone's minds, particularly in the government apparatus?
I don't think that this current situation may change in the nearest future, unless we see very dramatic advances by the Ukrainian army and these future defeats of Russian army, if there be anything like that, will leak somehow to the Russian society, which is now seems to be quite isolated from the news from the front line.
The advances, though, have been pretty dramatic in recent days, but you think more still is needed, or for the public to get a sense that things are falling apart, for the real mood to change?
I believe that we all need some kind of a very huge victory in the battle, some kind of taking over Kherson or Donbass, or even successful attack on Crimea, so that Russian society will start to understand that there is something wrong with all this special military operation.
Fiona Hill, I can see you nodding in agreement there at Boris Bondarev's definition almost of the sort of scale of event that would be a real game changer in Russia. But yet we hear President Putin last week saying, oh no, the Ukrainian operation hasn't had any consequences, negative consequences for Russia. Is that pure bravado at this stage, or do you think he's isolated from reality in a sense?
I don't think he's isolated from reality, but he's the kind of person who always knows that there will be operational setbacks. I mean, we have to remember who he was and how he was trained before he came into the presidency in Russia. He was a KGB operative. He was somebody who, he said himself in public many times, that knew that things could go wrong, and then that you have to learn and adapt your tactics as a result of that. I think he still thinks that he can turn this around, and I think that Mr. Bondarev is absolutely correct. It will take an awful lot more for this to really have an impact on the broader public and even more of the elites. Although we are seeing that Mr. Bondarev is not alone. There are reports of officials in St. Petersburg, others in Moscow, who are speaking out about this. We know, of course, there have been quite a lot of protests in the past. There's been a lot of people leaving Russia because they're not supportive of the war. And we also know that there are a lot of murmurings among military generals, because there's been such a high casualty rate in the general staff as well as in the regular forces. And many of them are really questioning where this military operation is headed. So I don't think that it's plain sailing for Vladimir Putin by any stretch, but I think that Mr. Bondarev is right. There's going to have to be a lot more setbacks for Vladimir Putin himself to think that it's time to declare victory and move on in a different direction.
And in terms of the Russian popular reception to what's going on, Boris Bondarev, Fiona Hill mentioned there have been these statements by some officials in St. Petersburg and Moscow today calling on President Putin to resign. We've seen a more frank language on some of the Russian official media. Does that penetrate the public consciousness at all? Does the public care in Russia? Because a lot of soldiers are dying in Ukraine.
Yes, and it's still, a riddle for many observers, including me, because we have that We know that there is a lot of coffins coming to many Russian provinces, and still we don't see any noticeable public reaction to that. I think those statements made by some municipal deputies yesterday and the other day in St. Petersburg and Moscow, I hope that there are the first signs of the change of public mood, so to speak. But I think we still need something more on the battlefield, on the front, to penetrate through this apathy of the Russian society.
And in terms of President Putin's options now, Fiona Hill, you mentioned at the start a kind of intensification of this trying to create more pain, this strategy of trying to create more pain for the Ukrainian people, whether it's through energy supplies, attacks on their cities, rocketing of Kharkiv that we've seen in the past 24 hours. But this does seem to be more of the same. And I wonder whether the concerns that were tabled by some people at the start of this, that President Putin might go, for example, for a nuclear option if things were going really badly. Do you think those can now safely be discarded, those worries, or is that still at the back of your mind?
Well, he's already gone for a nuclear option with the Zaporizhzhia plant, the power plant in Ukraine. Obviously, we've got great concerns about what the intentions are there. You've just reported that that's been taken off from the power grid again. We've obviously had an International Atomic Energy Agency mission there to express great concerns about it. In a way, Putin is using that to play with our fears. Because in part, he may have calculated up until now that using an actual tactical battlefield nuclear weapon might result in too much blowback, including from countries like China that have actually supported him. But we have to actually look at what he's doing in Zaporizhzhia. There are many other ways of terrorizing people on the thought of nuclear power. I think we also have to be very mindful of the way that he is manipulating energy insecurity in Europe and elsewhere. Knowing, for the UK, for example, energy prices are going to rise in October, and how that might be exploited, for example.
He's still clearly pinning his hopes on that strategy. Fiona Hill and Boris Bondarev, thank you both indeed very much. That's all from us in London. Let's go back now to Victoria in Edinburgh.
Thank you, and we're going to talk about obviously what's been happening here in Edinburgh, where the Queen is now lying at rest for 24 hours, and our political editor Nick Watt is here. What do you take from today?
Well, Victoria, the first thing I'd say that really struck me about today was that this was a deeply sad day for a family paying a very public farewell to a much-loved mother and grandmother. I was standing on the Mercat Cross, which is on the Royal Mile, as the royal procession came up the Royal Mile, and you could see that profound sense of loss on the faces of her 4 children. But the King was having to deal with that personal and family loss whilst at the same time form a new bond with his people as the new monarch. And I have to say, it's getting pretty clear from what King Charles is saying that he's very much going to be following in his mother's footsteps. So what does that mean? Well, in the first place, it means no contentious interventions in contended areas of public policy, but it also shows that he is going to be showing supreme sensitivity for the different stories and the different histories of the 4 constituent parts of the UK. And you think of that lasting image today of the crown of Scotland atop the Queen's coffin in St Giles Cathedral. Of course, that dates back to the time when Scotland was a wholly sovereign nation.
And talking of the visit to the 4 nations, tomorrow, talk our audience through where King Charles is going.
So the King will be going to Northern Ireland, and he'll be showing his support for the political settlement there by meeting the party leaders. Now, in the past, visiting Northern Ireland has been a painful and difficult journey for the Prince of Wales, as he then was, because, of course, his much-loved uncle, that's the late Lord Louis Mountbatten, was murdered by the IRA across the border in County Sligo in 1979. But I think once again we will be hearing the King saying that he will be following in the footsteps of his mother. Now, what did the late Queen do for Northern Ireland? Well, she played a very important role in fostering reconciliation in Northern Ireland and a very important role in laying to rest ghosts from the past in British-Irish relations. You think of her meeting the late Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, Martin McGuinness, a pivotal figure in the Republican movement. And I can tell you, having followed the peace process dating back nearly 30 years, talking to the key figures over those years, the Queen followed that peace process in absolutely minute detail.
Thank you, Nick. Nick Watt, our political editor. That is all from us tonight. I think it's just started to rain in Edinburgh. We are going to be in Belfast tomorrow, as King Charles, as Nick was saying, as King Charles visits Northern Ireland. Until then, from Edinburgh, have a very lovely evening.